again. I'm so glad you're here. I'm so glad I'm here. I'm so glad we can be reading The Voyage of the Dawn Treader together. Today we're getting ready to start chapter 3. Do you remember what happened in chapter 1 and 2? Do you remember Eustace? Oh my, yes, I'm sure you remember him. How he and Lucy and Edmund, who were staying at his house for the summer, well, you remember all about that. They were staying there for the house with Eustace at his house for the summer. Not that they really wanted to, but up in Lucy's bedroom, there was an amazing picture that they loved. And as the three of them were looking at it, suddenly the water splashed out of the picture and they were drawn into it. And before you knew it, they were on board a beautiful Narnian ship called the Dawn Treader. And to their great surprise and delight, there was Caspian. And there was Reepicheep too. So Edmund and Lucy were thrilled to be there. Eustace, not so much. You remember that too, don't you? Well, let's find out what happens next. This is called the Lone Islands. And before we start, let's have a little picture of the Lone Islands right here. So here's, what's it called here? I can't even read. Philomath. The writing on there is so fancy that I couldn't read it there. Okay, so at the top here is the island of Philomath, and that's what they're going to come to first. They're sailing this way, and then below that is the island of Dorn, and then over here is Azavra. Okay, those are the three lone islands. Land in sight, shouted a man from the top of the top of the mast. Lucy, who had been talking to Rince on the poop deck, came pattering down the ladder and raced forward. As she went, she was joined by Edmund, and they found Caspian, Drinian, and Reepicheep already up in the forecastle. It was a coldish morning, the sky very pale, and the sea very dark blue with little caps of foam. And there, a little way off on the starboard bow, was the nearest of the lone islands, Philomath, like a low green hill in the sea, and behind it, a little further off, the gray slopes of its sister, Dorn. Same old Philomath, same old Dorn, said Lucy, clapping her hands. Oh, Edmund, how long it is since you and I saw them last. I have never understood, said Caspian, why they belong to Narnia. Did Peter the High King conquer them? Asked Caspian. Oh, no, said Edmund. They were Narnian before our time, back in the days of the White Witch. And here C.S. Lewis puts in a little parenthesis. By the way, I have never yet learned how those remote islands became attached to the crown of Narnia, and if I do, and if the story is at all interesting, I may put it in some other book. Are we going to land here? Said Drinian. I don't think it would be much good landing on Philomath, said Edmund. It was almost uninhabited in our day, and it looks as if it's the same still. The people lived mostly on Dorn, and a little on Avra. That's the third one. We can't see it yet, but they only kept sheep on Philomath. Then we'll have to sail around that cape, I suppose, said Drinian, and land on Dorn. That'll mean rowing. I'm sorry we're not landing on Philomath, said Lucy. I'd love to walk there again. It was so lonely, a nice kind of loneliness, all grass and clover and soft sea air. I'd love to stretch my legs too, said Caspian. Tell you what, why don't we go ashore in the lifeboat and then send it back? And then we could walk across Philomath and let the Dawn Treader pick us up on the other side. If Caspian had been as experienced then as he became later on in this voyage, he would not have made this suggestion. But at the moment, it seemed like an excellent one. Oh, let's do it, said Lucy. You'll come, won't you? Said Caspian to Eustace, who had come on deck with his hand bandaged. Anything to get off this blasted boat, said Eustace. Blasted? Said Drinian. How do you mean? In a civilized country like I come from, said Eustace, the ships are so big that when you're inside, you don't even know that you're at sea at all. Well, in that case, you might as well just stay ashore, said Caspian. Tell them to lower the lifeboat, Drinian. The king, the mouse, the two Pevensies, and Eustace all got into the boat and were rowed to the beach at Philomath. When the boat had left them and was being rowed back, they all turned and looked around. They were surprised to see how small the Dawn Treader looked. Lucy was, of course, barefoot, having kicked off her shoes while swimming, but that's no hardship if you're going to walk on downy, soft turf. It was delightful to be ashore again, and to smell the earth and the grass. And if at first the ground seemed to be pitching up and down like a ship, that's what it usually does when you've been on a ship for a while. And it was much warmer here than on board, and the sand felt pleasant to Lucy's feet as they crossed the shore. There was a lark singing. They went inland up a fairly steep, though low, hill, and at the top, of course, they turned around and looked back. There was the Dawn Treader, looking like a great bright insect crawling across the sea northward with her oars rowing. Then they went over the top of the ridge, and they could see her no longer. Dorn now lay before them, divided from Felamath by a channel about a mile wide, and behind that and to the left lay Avra. The little white town of Narrowhaven on Dorn could easily be seen. "Hello, what's this?" said Edmund suddenly. In the green valley to which they were descending, 6 or 7 rough-looking men, all armed, were sitting under a tree. "Don't tell them who we are," said Caspian. "And I pray your majesty, why not?" said Reepicheep, who had been content to ride on Lucy's shoulder. "It has just occurred to me," said Caspian, "that no one here can have heard from Narnia for a long time. It's just possible that they may not acknowledge that we rule over them, in which case it might not be quite safe to identify myself as the king." "We have our swords, sire," said Reepicheep. "Yes, Reep, I know we have," said Caspian, "but if it's a question of reconquering these islands, I'd prefer to come back with a larger army." By this time, they were quite close to the strangers, one of whom, a big black-haired fellow, shouted, "Good morning to you." "And a good morning to you," said Caspian. "Is there still a governor of the Lone Islands?" "To be sure there is," said the man, "Governor Gumpus. His sufficiency is at Narrowhaven, but you'll stay and have a drink with us." Caspian thanked him, though neither he nor the others much liked the look of these new acquaintances, and all of them sat down. Here they are. They are a rough-looking bunch, aren't they? But hardly had they raised their cups to their lips when the black-haired man nodded to the others, and as quick as lightning, all 5 visitors found themselves wrapped in strong arms. There was a moment's struggle, but all the advantage was on one side, and soon everyone was disarmed and had their hands tied behind their backs, except Reepicheep, writhing in his captor's grip and biting furiously. "Careful with that beast, Tax," said the leader. "Don't damage him. He'll fetch the best price of the lot, I wouldn't wonder." "Coward poltroon!" squeaked Reepicheep. "Give me my sword and free my paws if you dare." "Whew!" whisked the slave trader, for that's what he was. "It can talk! Well, I never! I'm blowed if I take less than 200 crescents for him." Now, a crescent, as you may remember from the story of the horse and his boy, was the currency that they used in Calormen. Remember that? And in here, C.S. Lewis tells us that a crescent is worth 1/3 of a pound. Well, that doesn't tell us very much, does it? But back at the time when this book was written, if we could take an English pound from back then and convert it to American dollars now, each one of those pounds would have been worth about $30. So 1/3 of a pound would be $10. Did I do the math right on that? So he says, I wouldn't take less than 200 crescents for him. If a crescent is worth $10, that's like $2,000 they're going to ask for Reepicheep when they try to sell him in the slave market. Ooh. "So that's what you are," said Caspian, "kidnappers and slavers. I hope you're proud of it." Now, said the slaver. "Don't you start any of your jaw. The easier you take it, the pleasanter all round, see? I don't do this for fun. I've got to make my living just like anyone else. Where will you take us? Said Lucy, getting the words out with some difficulty. Oh, over to Narrow Haven, said the leader. Market day is tomorrow. Is there a British consulate there? Said Eustace. Is there a what? Said the man. But long before Eustace was tired of trying to explain, the slaver simply said, Well, I've had enough of this jabber. The mouse is a fair treat, but this one could talk the hind leg off a donkey. Off we go, mates. Then the 4 human prisoners were tied together, not cruelly, but securely, and made to march down to the shore. Reepicheep was carried. He had stopped biting on a threat of having his mouth tied up, but he had a great deal to say, and Lucy really wondered how any man could bear to have the things said to him that were said to the slave dealer. Here they are as they're being marched down to the shore. Can you see Reepicheep in the arms of the second last man? But the slave driver, far from objecting, only said, Go on, whenever Reepicheep paused for breath, occasionally adding, This is as good as a play, or wow, you can't help thinking that it almost knows what it's saying. Or which one of you was it that trained this mouse? This so infuriated Reepicheep that at the end of the number of things he had thought of saying all at once nearly suffocated him, and he became silent. When they got down to the shore that looked toward Dorne, they found a little village and a longboat on the beach, and lying a little further up, a dirty, bedraggled-looking ship. Now, youngsters, said the slave trader, let's have no fuss, and you'll have nothing to cry about. All aboard? At that moment, a fine-looking, bearded man came out of one of the houses, an inn probably, and said, Well, Pug, more of your usual wares? The slave trader, whose name seemed to be Pug, bowed very low and said in a wheedling kind of voice, Yes, your lordship. And how much do you want for that boy? Asked the other one, pointing to Caspian. Ah, said Pug, I knew your lordship would pick out the best. No deceiving your lordship with anything second rate. Oh, now that boy I've taken a fancy to myself. Got kind of fond of him, I have. I'm that tender-hearted I shouldn't have ever taken this job. Still, to a customer like your lordship. Ooh, this sounds like another obsequious sycophant, doesn't it? Tell me your price, Carrion, said the lord sternly. Carrion is dead animal that a vulture or an eagle would eat. He's calling the slave trader Carrion, not a very flattering title. Tell me your price, Carrion, said the lord sternly. Do you think I want to listen to the rigmarole of your filthy trade? 300 crescents, my lord, to your honorable lordship, but to anyone else, I'll give you 150. Oh, please, please, broke in Lucy. Don't separate us, whatever you do. You don't know. But then she stopped, for she saw that Caspian, even now, didn't want to be known. 150 then, said the lord. And as for you, little maiden, I'm sorry I can't buy you all. Unrope my boy, Pug, and look, treat these others well while they're in your hands, or it'll be the worse for you. Well, said Pug, now who ever heard of a gentleman in my way of business who treated his stock better than I do? Why, I treat them like my own children. That's likely to be true, said the other grimly. The dreadful moment had now come. Caspian was untied, and his new master said, This way, lad. And Lucy burst into tears, and Edmund looked very blank. But Caspian looked over his shoulder and said, Cheer up, I'm sure it'll be all right in the end. So long. Now, missy, said Pug, don't you start taking on and spoiling your pretty looks for the market tomorrow. You be a good girl, and then you won't have anything to cry about, see? Then they were rowed out to the slave ship and taken below into a long, rather dark place, none too clean, where they found many other unfortunate prisoners. For Pug was, of course, a pirate, and had just returned from cruising around the island and capturing whoever he could. The children didn't meet anyone they knew. The prisoners were mostly Galmians and Terebinthians. And there they sat in the straw and wondered what was going to happen to Caspian, and tried to stop Eustace talking as if everybody except himself was to blame. Meanwhile, Caspian was having a much more interesting time. The man who had bought him had led him down a little lane between two of the village houses and out into an open place behind the village, and then he turned and faced him. "You needn't be afraid of me, boy," he said. "I'll treat you well enough. I bought you for your face. You remind me of someone." "May I ask of whom, my lord?" said Caspian. "You remind me of my master, King Caspian of Narnia." Then Caspian decided to risk everything at one stroke. "My lord," he said, "I am your master. I am Caspian, King of Narnia." "Well, how do I know this is true?" "Firstly, by my face," said Caspian. "Secondly, because I know within 6 guesses who you are. You are one of the 7 lords of Narnia whom my uncle Miraz set to sea, and whom I have come to look for. Argos, Bern, Octesian, Restimar, Malmavron, and I've forgotten the last one. And finally, if your lordship will give me a sword, I will prove in any way, in a clean battle, that I am Caspian, the son of Caspian, lawful king of Narnia, lord of Caraparavel, and emperor of the Lone Islands." "By heaven," said the man, "it is his father's very voice and trick of speech. Your Majesty." And there in the field he knelt down and kissed the king's hand. "The moneys your lordships dispersed to our person will be made good from our own treasury," said Caspian. "They're not in Pug's purse yet, sire," said the Lord Byrne, for that's who it was, "and never will be, I trust. I have moved his sufficiency, the governor, 100 times to crush this vile man's traffic in flesh." "My Lord Byrne," he said, "we must talk of the state of these islands, but first, what is your lordship's own story?" "Short enough, sire," said Byrne. "I came thus with my 6 fellows. I loved a girl of the islands, and felt I'd had enough of the sea. And there was no purpose in returning to Narnia while your Majesty's uncle held the reins, so I married, and I've lived here ever since." "And what is this governor, this Gumpus, like? Does he still acknowledge the king of Narnia for his lord?" "In words, yes. All is done in the king's name, but he would not be pleased to find the real live king of Narnia coming in upon him. And if your Majesty had come before him alone and unarmed, well, he would not deny his allegiance to you, but he would pretend to not believe you. Your Majesty's life would be in grave danger." "What following do you have in these waters?" "Well, there is my ship, just rounding the point," said Caspian. "We're about 30 swords if it came to fighting. Shall we have my ship come in and fall upon Pug and free my friends, whom he holds captive?" "Not by my counsel," said Byrne. "As soon as there was a fight, 2 or 3 ships would put out from Narrahaven to rescue Pug. Your Majesty must work by show of more power than you really have, and by the terror of the king's name. It must not come to a battle. Gumpus is a chicken-hearted man, and he can be overawed." After a little more conversation, Caspian and Byrne walked down to the coast a little west of the village, and there Caspian blew his horn. This was not the great magic horn of Queen Susan. He had left that at home for his regent Trumpkin to use if any great need fell upon the land in the king's absence. Drinian, who was on the lookout for a signal, recognized the royal horn at once, and the Dawn Treader began starting into shore. Then the lifeboat pulled out again, and in a few minutes, Caspian and the Lord Byrne were on deck, explaining the situation to Drinian. He, just like Caspian, wanted to lay the Dawn Treader in alongside the slave ship at once and board her, but Byrne made the same objection. "Steer straight down this channel, Captain," said Byrne, "and then around to Avra, where my own estates are. But first, run up the king's banner. Hang out all the shields and send as many men to the fighting top as you can. And about 5 bow shots hence, when you get open sea on your port side, run up a few signals." Signals? To whom? Said Drinian. Why, to all the other ships that we haven't got, but which my Gumpus might think we do have. Oh, I see, said Drinian, rubbing his hands, and they'll read our signals. What shall I say? Whole fleet round the south of Avra and assemble at Burnstead, said Lord Byrne. That'll do excellently. Their whole journey, if there were any ships, could be out of sight from Narrowhaven. Caspian was sorry for the others languishing in the hold of Pug's slave ship, but he couldn't help finding the rest of that day very enjoyable. Late in the afternoon, for they had to do it all by oar, they turned to the starboard round the northeast end of Dorne and around again to the point of Avra, and they entered into a good harbor on Avra's southern shore, where Byrne's pleasant lands sloped down to the water's edge. Byrne's people, many of whom they saw working in the fields, were all free men, and it was a happy and prosperous fief, or landholding. Here they all went ashore and were royally feasted in a low-pillared house overlooking the bay. Byrne's gracious wife and merry daughters made them good cheer. But after dark, Byrne sent a message over the boat by Dorne in order to make some preparations. He doesn't say exactly what for the following day. Here's the Dawn Treader with her shields all out and some signals. Those are those flags flying, supposedly warning other ships in Caspian's fleet to come and help them. We know there weren't any, but Gumpus didn't know that. So, well, let's find out what happens in the next chapter. Chapter 4, what Caspian did there. Next morning, the Lord Byrne called his guests early, and after breakfast, he asked Caspian to order every man he had into full armor. And above all, he added, let everything be as trim and scoured as if it were the morning of the first battle of a great war between noble kings and all the world was looking on. This was done. And then 3 boatloads, Caspian and his people, and Byrne with a few of his, put out for Narrowhaven. The king's flag flew in the stern of his boat, and his trumpeter was with him. When they reached the jetty at Narrowhaven, Caspian found a considerable crowd around to meet them. This is what I sent word about last night, said Byrne. These are friends of mine and honest people. And as soon as Caspian stepped ashore, the crowd broke out in hurrahs and shouts of, Narnia, Narnia, long live the king! At the same moment, and this was also due to Byrne's messengers, bells began ringing from many parts of the town. Then Caspian caused his banner to be advanced and his trumpet to be blown, and every man drew his sword and set his face into joyful sternness. And they marched up the street so that the street shook, and their armor shone, for it was a sunny morning, so that one could hardly look at it steadily. Here they are, all coming up from the boat up into the town. Can you see the ship off into the harbor there? Okay. At the castle gate, Caspian's trumpet blew a loud blast and cried, Open for the king of Narnia, come to visit his trusty and well-beloved servant, the governor of the Lone Islands. In those days, everything in the islands was done in a slovenly, slouchy manner. Only the little postern gate was opened, and out came a rumpled-looking soldier with a dirty old hat on his head instead of a helmet and a rusty old pike in his hand. He blinked at the flashing figures before him. And he said, which was to say, you can't see his sufficiency. No interviews without appointments except between 9 and 10 on the second Saturday of every month. Obey the king of Narnia, you dog! Thundered Lord Byrne, and dealt him a sharp rap with his gauntleted hand, which set his hat flying from his head. What's all this about? Said the doorkeeper, but nobody took any notice of him. 2 of Caspian's men stepped through the postern gate, which is a little gate either beside the main one or sometimes actually a little door inside the actual main one so that you could open the small one if you didn't want to open the big one. The postern gate, that's called. So he stepped through the postern, and afterwards, with some struggling with bars and bolts, for everything was so rusty, he flung wide both wings of the gate wide open, and the king and his followers strode into the courtyard. Here, a number of the governor's guards were lounging about, and several more of them, who were mostly wiping their mouths, came tumbling out of various doorways. Oh, their armor was in a disgraceful condition. These were the fellows who might have fought if they had been led or had known what was happening. So this was a dangerous moment for Caspian. But Caspian gave them no time to think. "Where is the captain?" he asked. "I am more or less, if you know what I mean," said a languid and rather dandified young person without any armor on at all. "It is our wish," said Caspian, "that our royal visitation to the realm of the Lone Islands should be an occasion of joy and not of terror to our loyal subjects. If it were not for that, I would have something to say about the state of your men's armor and their weapons. As it is, you are pardoned. Command that a cask of wine be opened so that your men may drink to our health. But at noon tomorrow, I wish to see them here in this courtyard looking more like men-at-arms and not like vagabonds. See to it, at the pain of our extreme displeasure." The captain gaped, but Byrne immediately cried, "3 cheers for the king!" And the soldiers who had understood about that cask of wine, even if they understood nothing else, joined in. Caspian then ordered most of his own men to remain in the courtyard, and he, with Byrne and Drinian and 4 others, went into the hall. Behind a table at the far end, with various secretaries around him, sat his sufficiency, the governor of the Lone Islands. Gumpus was a bilious-looking man with hair that had once been red and was now mostly gray. He glanced up as the strangers entered, and then looked down at his papers, saying automatically, "No interviews without appointments except between 9 and 10 on second Saturdays." Caspian nodded to Byrne and then stood aside. Byrne and Drinian took a step forward, and each seized one end of the table. They lifted it and flung it over to one side of the hall, where it rolled over, scattering a cascade of letters and documents and inkpots and pens. And then, not roughly, but firmly, as if their hands were pincers of steel, they plucked Gumpus out of his chair and deposited him facing it about 4 feet away. Caspian at once sat down in the chair and laid his sword across his knees. "My lord," he said, fixing his eyes on Gumpus, "you have not given us quite the welcome which we expected. We are the King of Narnia." In England, the tradition is that when you are the king, when people speak to you, they use the plural of the pronoun. So he would say, "We are the King of Narnia," not "I am the King of Narnia." It's called the royal plural, if you're wondering about that. "We are the King of Narnia." "Nothing about it in the correspondence," said the governor. "Nothing about it in the minutes. We have not been notified of any such thing. All very irregular, but I'm happy to consider your application." "And we are come to inquire into your sufficiency's conduct in your office," continued Caspian. "There are 2 points especially which I wish you to give me an explanation. First, I find no record that the tribute due from these islands to the Crown of Narnia has been received for about 150 years. "Well, that would be a question to raise at the council next month," said Gumpus. "If anyone moves that a commission of inquiry be set up to report on the financial history of the islands at the first meeting next year, well then, I also find it very clearly written in our laws," Caspian went on, "that if the tribute is not delivered, the whole debt has to be paid by the governor out of his own private purse." At this, Gumpus began to pay real attention. "Oh, that's quite out of the question," he said. "It's an economic impossibility, your majesty. You must be joking." Inside, he was wondering if there was any way of getting rid of these unwelcome visitors. Had he known that Caspian only had 1 ship, and 1 ship's company with him, He would have spoken soft words for the moment and hoped to have them all surrounded and killed during the night. But he had seen a ship of war sailing down the straits yesterday and had seen it signaling, as he supposed, to its consorts. That, of course, was the Dawn Treader. He had not known then that it was the king's ship, for there wasn't enough wind to spread out the flag and make the Golden Lion visible, so he had just waited for further developments. Now he imagined that the Caspian had a whole fleet at Brunsted. It would never occurred to Gumpus that anyone would walk into Narrowhaven to take the islands with less than 50 men. It was certainly not at all the kind of thing he could imagine doing himself. Secondly, said Caspian, I want to know why you have permitted this abominable and unnatural traffic in slaves to row up here, contrary to the ancient custom and usage of our dominions. Oh, it's necessary and unavoidable, said his sufficiency, an essential part of the economic development of the islands, I assure you. Our present burst of prosperity depends on it. What need do you have of slaves? Oh, for export, your majesty. We sell them to Kellerman, mostly, and we have other markets. We're a great center of the trade. In other words, said Caspian, you don't need them. Tell me what purpose they serve except to put money into the pockets of people like Pug. Oh, your majesty's tender years, said Gumpus, with what was meant to be a fatherly smile, hardly make it possible that you could understand the economic problems involved. I have statistics, I have graphs, I have tender as my years may be, said Caspian. I believe I understand the slave trade from within quite as well as your sufficiency, and I do not see that it brings the island meat or bread or beer or wine or timber or cabbages or books or any instruments of music or horse or armor or anything else worth having. But whether it does or not, it must be stopped. But that would be putting the clock back, gasped the governor. Have you no idea of progress, of development? I have seen them both in an egg, said Caspian. We call it going bad in Narnia. This trade must stop. I can take no responsibility for any such measures, said Gumpus. Very well, then, said Caspian. We relieve you of your office. My Lord Byrne, come here. And before Gumpus realized what had happened, Byrne was kneeling with his hands between the king's hands and taking the oath to govern the Lone Islands in accordance with the old customs, rights, usages, and laws of Narnia. And Caspian said, I think we have had enough of governors, and made Byrne a duke, the Duke of the Lone Islands. And as for you, my lord, he said to Gumpus, I forgive your debt for the tribute you owe me, but before noon tomorrow, you and your people must be out of the castle, which is now the Duke's residence. Oh, look here, this is all very well, said one of Gumpus's secretaries, but supposing all you gentlemen stop play-acting and we do a little business. The question before us really is, said the Duke, whether you and the rest of the rabble will leave without a flogging or with one. You may choose which you prefer. When all of this had been pleasantly settled, Caspian ordered horses, of which there were a few in the castle, though very ill-groomed, and he, with Byrne and Drinian and a few others, rode out into the town and made for the slave market. It was a long, low building near the harbor, and the scene that they found going on inside was very much like any other auction. That is to say, there was a great crowd, and Pug, on a platform, was roaring out in a raucous voice, Now, gentlemen, lot 23, 5 Terebinthian agricultural laborers suitable for the mines or the galleys. You remember that the galleys were those ships where slaves had to sit way down low and row and row and row all day, every day, with very little to eat and hardly anything to drink until they often just dropped dead. It was a horrible, horrible sentence to have to be sent to the galleys. Under 25 years of age, not too bad in his teeth. Good brawny fellow, here, take off your shirt and let the gentleman see. There's muscles for you. Look at the chest on him. 10 crescents for this gentleman in the corner. You must be joking, sir. 15, 18 is bidden for lot 23. Any advance on 18? 21. Thank you, sir. 21 is bidden. But Pug stopped and gaped when he saw the armor-clad figures who had clanked up onto the platform. On your knees, every one of you, to the King of Narnia, said the Duke. Everyone heard the horses jingling and stamping outside, and many had heard some rumor of the landing and events in the castle, and most obeyed. Those who did not were pulled down by their neighbors, and some cheered. Your life is forfeit, Pug, for laying hands on our royal person yesterday, said Caspian, but your ignorance is pardoned. The slave trade has been forgiven in all our dominions a quarter of an hour ago, and I declare every slave in this slave market is free. He held up his hand to check the cheering of the slaves and went on. Where are my friends? Oh, that dear little gal and the nice young gentleman, said Pug with an ingratiating smile. Why, they were snapped up at once. We're here, Caspian, cried Lucy and Edmund together. At your service, sire, peeped Reepicheep from another corner. They had all been sold, but the men who had bought them were staying to bid for other slaves, and so they had not yet been taken away. The crowd parted to let the three of them out, and there was great hand-clasping and greeting between them and Caspian. Two merchants from Calormen at once approached. The Calormen have dark faces and long beards. They wear flowing robes and orange-colored turbans, and they are a wise, a wealthy, a courteous, and a cruel people. They bowed most politely to Caspian and paid him long compliments all about the fountains of prosperity, irrigating the gardens of prudence and virtue, and things like that. But of course, what they wanted back was the money that they had paid. That is only fair, sirs, said Caspian. Every man who has bought a slave today must have his money back. Pug, bring out your takings to the last minim. Minim is 1/40th of a crescent. And I'm not that good at math to figure out how much money that was worth. If a crescent is $30, you figure out what 1/40th of that would be. Does your majesty mean to make a beggar out of me? Whined Pug. You have lived on broken hearts all your life, said Caspian. And if you are a beggar, it is better to be a beggar than to be a slave. But where is my other friend? Oh, him, said Pug. Well, you can take him and welcome. I'm glad to have him off my hands. I have never seen such a drag on the market in all my born days. I priced him at 5 crescents, and even so nobody would have him. I threw him in for free with some other lots, and still nobody would have him. They wouldn't touch him, wouldn't look at him. Tex, bring out Mr. Sulky. Thus Eustace was produced, and sulky he certainly looked. For though no one would want to be sold as a slave, it's perhaps even more galling to be a sort of utility slave that nobody even will buy. He walked up to Caspian and said, I see. As usual, you've been enjoying yourself somewhere while the rest of us were prisoners. I suppose you haven't even found out about the British Council. A consul. That's like the British ambassador in a foreign country. Of course you haven't. That night they had a great feast in the castle of Narrowhaven, and then tomorrow for the beginning of our real adventures, said Reepicheep when he had made his bows to everyone and went to bed. But it couldn't really be tomorrow or anything like it, for now they were preparing to leave all known lands and seas behind them, and the fullest preparations had to be made. The Dawn Treader was empty and drawn on land by 8 horses over rollers, and every bit of her was gone over by the most skilled shipwrights. Then she was launched again, and food and water was put in as much as she could hold, that is, for 28 days of sailing. Even this, as Edmund noticed with disappointment, only gave them 14 days eastward sailing before they had to turn around and come back. While all this was being done, Caspian missed no chance of questioning all the oldest sea captains about what he could find in Narrowhaven to learn if they had any knowledge or even rumors of land further to the east. He poured out many a bottle of ale to the weather-beaten men with short gray beards and clear blue eyes, and many a tall tale he heard in return, but Those who seemed the most truthful could tell him of no lands beyond the lone islands, and many thought that if you came too far east, you would come into the surges of a sea without land that swirled perpetually around and around the rim of the world. And that, I reckon, is where your Majesty's friends went to the bottom. The rest of them only had wild stories of in islands inhabited by headless men, floating islands, water spouts, and a fire that burned along the water. Only one, to Reepicheep's delight, said, and beyond that is Aslan's country, but that's beyond the edge of the world and you can't get there. But when they questioned him, he could only say that he heard that from his father. Byrne could only tell them that he had seen his 6 companions sail away eastward and that nothing had ever been heard from them since. He said this when he and Caspian were standing on the highest point of Avra, looking down on the eastern ocean. I've often been up here in a morning, said the Duke, when the same sun came up out of the sea, and sometimes it looked as if the sun was only a couple of miles away. And I've wondered about my friends, and wondered if there really is something beyond that horizon. Nothing most likely, but I'm always half ashamed that I stayed behind. But I wish your Majesty wouldn't go. We may really need your help here. The closing of the slave market might make a whole new world, and it might be war with Kellerman in that new world. That's what I foresee. Please think again. I have my oath, my Lord Duke, said Caspian. And anyway, what could I say to Reepicheep? And that's the end of chapter 4. Next time we'll read the storm and what came of it. Caspian is a brave young man, isn't he? That was quite a good idea of his and Drinians to fool the Narnians to fool the Sufficiency, Gumpus, into thinking that he had a huge navy waiting, and none of it was true, but he managed to convince them all to take him seriously, and now they've freed the slaves. They're all back on board ship. Let's find out next time what they find when they sail further east than anybody has ever gone, except for, of course, Lord Byrne's friends. They went further on, but whatever happened to them, that's what Caspian wants to find out. And that's what we'll find out when I see you next time. Bye. Love you all. Goodbye.